we're gonna get started. So today is a switch. Over the last three weeks, we've been talking about family, and over the next 3 weeks, including this week, we're going to be talking about power and citizen diplomacy. So today it's going to be just me talking with you guys about power. I'm a political sociologist by training, and have long been interested in citizens, ordinary citizens, and whether and how we exercise power. So I want to share with you some thoughts on that, and also kind of have discussion along the way and ask you some questions. So it's going to be a little different from what we've been talking about. And you might wonder, like, so we're going from like family to talking about these big kind of abstract concepts. But I hope it'll be interesting to you, because essentially this will have bearing directly on our ability to make social change, which is ultimately, I think, what we each are interested in part, aside from advancing ourselves, is trying to make the world a better place. So with that said, I am going to share my screen and share with you this set of slides. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. So I want to start off by telling you guys what basically we're going to be talking about. So today's meeting has 3 parts, and we're going to be talking about essentially what kind of world we live in, and particularly a certain condition that exists in the world. We're also going to be talking about international relations, and then I'm going to talk about kind of some basic concepts in trying to understand power, that has some application to us as citizen diplomats, and we will finish off with discussion. So there's going to be discussion throughout this, and you are welcome. I want to encourage you to actually use the Zoom chat as well. But we're going to jump in with a question, and that is, I'm wondering if some of you can tell us what's one thing you would most like to change in your country or the world. You can raise your hand, and raise your electronic hand, and because I actually can't see you otherwise, or you can just write your comments in the chat. So Emma first.
So I'm from Massachusetts, the United States. One thing that I would change about the United States is probably our gun control laws, just with recent events that have happened within our country.
Yep, good one. Leroy?
Yeah, for me, it's actually restricted to my country. If I have the opportunity to change something in my country, it would be the laws that govern the branches of government in my country, because we notice that this law is actually, or these laws are actually used against the citizen rather than in favor of them. So I would first change those laws, or ask for the citizen to amend such laws so that we will have a better law that will serve my citizen. So that's what I would change for my country. And when it comes to the war, the migration, the tax, I got it. There are things that I attach to migration in my country that I noticed even in Africa as a whole that I actually against. And if I have the opportunity to change it, I will change it, because it can actually give the local people hard time immigrating from either my country to another neighboring country, or from another neighboring country to my country. So I will change such rule.
Okay, interesting. Joe Tolles.
I'm from the United States, and I think I will tackle the world first, in that I would like to be able to eliminate the formal and informal caste system that exists.
It's pretty ambitious.
Well, yes.
But that's good. Itay.
All right, are you hearing me?
Yes.
All right, I'm from Zimbabwe, by the way, currently in South Africa. The issue that I want to change, or I want to bring change in my country, as well as influence other countries, is the issue of parenting, because we are having so many children who are fatherless and unparented kids. So I think I had to tackle on that one.
Okay, very good. I'm going to skip to Tennille, and then we're going to actually move on. But I know that a number of you have your hands raised, but Tennille, if you could.
Yeah, mine might seem a little controversial. I have a thing against social media. So I would remove like TikTok, Instagram, all these things, because I feel we have a lot of people who are quote unquote influencers and they're really not having a positive impact on the younger generation. So I would remove that so that they'd be able to put more focus on like literature and works, and people, they don't find philosophers and stuff anymore. So I would eradicate that completely and just confine it like if it never existed. So that is what I would do. Yeah.
Wow. So clearly, we all have like ideas of what things should be changed, and in many cases we're actually passionate about it, and we devote in some cases devote our lives or our volunteer hours to making that happen. So this today is focused on trying to think about how you can go about making change by thinking fundamentally about power, because ultimately power is related to social change. So I want to start off by basically stepping back and talking a little bit about the kind of world that we live in. And some of you may have seen this before because I've talked about this before, but it really is important to understanding the problems that we have in the world and the condition in which we live. In complex, globalizing world that we live in, we are intertwined yet disconnected, which essentially means that our modern lives depend on strangers across the world, yet we don't really feel connected to each other. And we have trouble in many cases getting along and cooperating for mutual benefit. So this is kind of a fundamental condition. And so this leads to a different question, which is, can you think of examples of how we are all intertwined yet disconnected? And go ahead and raise your hands electronically when you do. Chirunim, calling us from Nigeria.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity to talk, and my video is off because of my poor network, so I'll just go right to speak. So in this world, we are both interconnected and disconnected, both intertwined and disconnected, because, you know, the social media brings us together more now because the world is not a global village because of advancements in digital technology. Yet, despite this, we live in our various countries, in our various cities, facing unique challenges, while still being connected to this global village.
Good. And so, Chirunim, can you be even more specific about the ways in which we're connected? Like, think of some sort of an example that people are connected to each other without knowing each other.
Okay, let me use an example of social media. Let me use like social media, for example. We have thousands of friends who on Facebook, these are called friends. you know, but despite this, we have over 1,000 of them which we don't even know or probably have not scrolled through their photos before and can't recognize them when we see them in public, but yet they are friends which are on Facebook. So yeah, this is what I mean. Yes.
Yep. Yeah. No, I think that's a good one. So one way in which we're kind of connected but not connected, or is that we are kind of like connected via social media, and yet we don't know people particularly well, most of the people that we're connected to, and yet we share to some extent our lives with them online. Joe Tolles in the United States.
The example I want to give is sort of the distribution, attainment, the sharing of natural resources, and how that impacts everybody in the world, negatively maybe and positively for some.
Can you give a specific example?
Oil, for instance, how we either invade and take it, or share it, or pay for it through, cooperatives that decide on the price of it, and how that impacts everybody, every country's economy.
You know, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because Chirunim, who just spoke, and Justice, who is about to speak, I think I'm hearing interference, but in any case, I hope none of you are hearing that. But both of them live in Nigeria, and both of them, I just heard on CNN that, you know, the oil sector, because they produce a lot of oil and they export oil, is not doing well. It's antiquated. In fact, they mentioned Port Harcourt, where Justice and Chirunim live in Nigeria, and noted that it's the system for producing oil is decrepit. Hasn't been well maintained. Part of it is because the leaders of the oil business in Nigeria have basically been enriching themselves, and then they send their kids off to England and France, and sometimes they live in other countries. They live very nice lives and so on, and they're essentially taking the riches of the people of Nigeria and for themselves, rather than investing that oil money in the welfare of the people. So that's an interesting example. I'm glad you mentioned oil, because there are ways in which we are connected without realizing it. Justice from Nigeria. Justice, can you hear us? Justice, I think, has some connection issues. So I'm gonna pass to Aaron.
Okay. Because of the nature of now.
Okay, go ahead, Justice.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Because of connection issue, Garden City
I think we can hear you. Yep.
Okay. The Garden City of Port Harcourt, Nigeria, and West Africa. Now, one of the examples how we are all intertwined yet disconnected. I think I will have to cite two examples. One should be locally. First, in a social organization, and every organization have a vision, have a mission, have what it tends to achieve. So people comes from diverse ethnic, diverse religion in order to get intertwined to achieve the goal of that organization. But at times they get disconnected. What gets them disconnected? The different ideologies. Because when different persons comes together, each and every one of them trying to bring his own ideology, to some extent, it doesn't work. Because each and every one of them would want to project or would want his or her own ideology to be the one to be set or to be carried. So in the course of that, they get disconnected. Now, coming back to the international system, each of the states in the international system tends to project her foreign policy. Because one of the reasons for the international system is for the states within the international system to socialize, to share things in common, both the developing, and the less developed states. So now in the international system, each of the states has their foreign policy with them, which they tend to say in the international system. Even though they come together to socialize, they come together to get intertwined, but to some extent, they get disconnected because each of them wants each of them wants her foreign policy to be recognized, wants her foreign policy to say, wants her foreign policy to be recognized, wants to project the country's foreign policy ahead of that of other countries. That's my own example on that.
Yep. Very good. We're going to take one more, and that's Aaron Akomea.
Yeah, good afternoon. So I'm speaking from Ghana, and I want to take a specific example. When you take the Ghanaian society, we have a lot of people, a lot of tribes. You know, we in fact, just on the hindsight, we can count about 26 different dialects that are spoken here. But when you go deep into it, you know, each and every one is somehow related. All the tribes are somehow related to each other, but because of, you know, individual interests, we are disconnected somehow. And so we see they against, you know, us. That is that kind of division. And you know, they work against each other. And so there is so much disunity. But when you go back into generations, these are people who are interrelated by blood or by, you know, all kind of associations. So that is how we disconnected, but generationally intertwined.
Good. So you guys are thinking a variety of ways, and some of them are political, some of them are economic, that we're intertwined. And so keep this in mind, right? This is kind of a fundamental challenge that we have, that we're intertwined with each other, and yet we are oftentimes strangers to each other, and we're not connected to each other. And that's one of the challenges that we're trying to wrestle with in trying to change the world, or trying to change our country, or trying to just change our community. So here are some other ways that we're intertwined, and some of them relate to what you guys just said. I think one of you mentioned, right, that I think it was Leroy, he mentioned we want to be able to move across borders more easily. And that is in fact what some people are doing. Unfortunately, they're not necessarily able to do it. Sometimes they're forced to do it because of conditions are so intolerable in their countries. Or sometimes we want to move to another place for better opportunity. So in any case, there's a lot of movement across different countries, and it mixes people. So we're, in that sense, we're becoming intertwined, but not necessarily connected, right? In a sense that we get along and we actually collaborate with each other. A second way in which our world is intertwined is, and yet in some senses disconnected, gets at what Justice just pointed out, which is there are a lot of countries in the world that have their own foreign policies, but they're not necessarily collaborating effectively. And it's becoming more of a problem, you might say, because we live in increasingly a multipolar world. In other words, it's not just the United States that's dominating. It's not just Russia, or it's not just one big empire like the Roman Empire. You have growing numbers of countries that are developing influence, and they're asserting their interests and so on. So we have to figure out how to collaborate more in a multipolar world. Another way is that more goods and services are being exchanged across the world. I bring up the examples of when I go to in the United States, pharmacies sell everything, including nuts. And if you walk into a CVS in the United States and pick up a container of nuts, and I encourage those of you who have a CVS near you to do this, the CVS brand of nuts, and take a look at the ingredients, you'll find that the nuts come from all over the place. It's literally something like 20 to 40 different countries that they're collecting these nuts from. So literally in this little can of nuts, I have like the globalization across the world in a can of nuts. And so there are a variety of ways. Cars is another example. You may have a car that's made in Japan, but there are different parts of the car that come from all over the world. So there are all kinds. That's another way in which we're intertwined, right? There are these strangers in different parts of the world that are coming together and collaborating in order to build our cars, but they're strangers to some extent to each other in this global economy. And then lastly, of course, a lot of the challenges that we face, and in fact, you might say a growing number of the challenges that we face are in fact international. So climate change, disease, terrorism, piracy, and by piracy, it's not just piracy. When we think of piracy, we think of pirates, and there are pirates. So for instance, off the coast of Somalia, there are people who attack commercial ships in order to try to improve their lives. But it's also cyber piracy, right? And that is an international problem. Among other things, in the United States, we're concerned about Russian cyber piracy and the damage that they can do to us. And so the internet is really, it doesn't respect borders. It is something that's connecting us, and it has a massive impact on our lives. The more and more time that we spend on the internet, as Tennille was pointing out with social media and other reasons. So in immigration, refugees, cybercrime, tax evasion, et cetera, and so forth, there are all kinds of ways in which we are intertwined. So I want to introduce a little theory here, and I think this is going to be helpful to you. Some of you may be familiar with this because it's very basics theory in international affairs, but it is intended to give you a sense of how people in international affairs answer this question: what foremost determines relations between countries and peoples of the world? And in the realist school, power and interests determine relations between peoples and countries. In idealism, it's not power and interests so much as ideas that move people and that shape relations between countries, right? So it could be a conflict between during the Cold War between Russian communism versus American capitalism and democracy. Or it could be nowadays a conflict between traditional, more religious people and more modern people who want freedom and other things that religious people find more threatening. So idealism argues it's really ideas that drive what we do and that drive relations between countries and peoples. And then there's constructivism, which argues really it's individuals. There are certain people, particularly elites, people who are very powerful, who are the directors of major institutions, the World Bank, the European Union, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, all kinds of associations that these people, these elites, really are the ones that determine relations between countries and peoples. So think about those, because they are conflicting, you might say, views of what is determining relations between us and what's determining who has power and who gets to make decisions and what kinds of relations that we have. So that has implications for what we do, and it includes that we have as citizen diplomats. It is true that power and interests matter, right? And they greatly determine our well-being as people wherever we are in the world. Two, idealism matters too. In other words, ideas matter too. People talk about democracy and freedom and religion all the time, and it seems to drive to some extent our behavior and our relations between us. It is, for instance, in the United States, as some of you guys know, there is increasing conflict between people who are more religious and not religious in the United States. And then, of course, individuals, of course, matter, especially if they're powerful. But it's not just elites that matter. We also have power as ordinary citizens in ways that we don't often recognize. And this is something that we're going to come to. So,
Paul,
yes.
can I just challenge something?
Yes.
The concept of people in this country being more religious versus those that are less religious, I would challenge that that those people that are claiming to be more religious are using the concept, the idea of religion, to amass power as opposed to being truly more religious.
Yeah. And Joe, I don't think anybody can argue with you on that. There are ways in which people use ideas to manipulate other people into following them, et cetera, and so forth. And it is something that we have to be worried about, right? I was just watching on Al Jazeera television about India and the ways in which the leading political party that's in power now is trying to reinstate Hinduism. And so they push Hinduism, and they're threatening the minority, the Muslim minority, which is about 20% of the population increasingly. And there are concerns, growing concerns, that there might be a serious massacres of Muslims, all in the name of promoting an idea, which is, you know, the domination of Hindu power, and this other idea that Muslims are a threat. So you know, ideas have real consequences. They really do matter. And sometimes people manipulate ideas to, as you're quite rightly pointing out, to amass power. So I want to introduce you a little bit about power, but I first want to get some thoughts from you guys. What the heck is power to you? How would you define it? And why do you think everybody should understand power? Leroy, remind us where you are calling from. I can't remember. Is it Liberia?
All right, I am calling from Liberia, and I want to first start with power, the definition of power. In my own understanding, power is a controlling influence. The controlling influence, and everyone is up to understand power, because it is the what supersedes every department of the country or every aspect of the world. If the country, political party, or the government of a specific country doesn't understand power, definitely there will be riots, there will be protests, there will be so many things that will happen, because the citizens themselves will not be satisfied with their ruling. So it is most important for people who are, especially in political aspects, to understand what is power before acceding to any other office. And the citizens themselves do need to understand power, so that when the government is going in certain direction, they will not be confused and come up with a backup plan, or maybe a plan that will hinder the progress of the country. So that's my understanding of power.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Leroy. Ite, which Ite, if I remember correctly, you are from Zimbabwe, but living in South Africa. Am I getting things wrong?
Yeah, that is right. I'm
Okay.
currently in South Africa. The way I understand power is the authority given by the source of a group of people who can be in charge of controlling or enforcing changing the systems and the influence in order to influence or rule the masses or the environment. That's what I think.
Okay, good. Mulba, who is joining us from Liberia. Mulba.
Thank you so much. So let me say good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone. And so I'm Bob Isaac from Liberia. And so the question first regarding power, what power is, in my own sense of reasoning, I see power to me, the ability, it could be internal or external, but the ability to influence or to make or change. So that's what I see power to look like. So in terms of why should everyone understand power? Well, everyone should understand power because everyone has power one way or the other. This is just something I want us to understand. There are different forms in which power appears. So you have power within. So power within is something that everyone ought to understand what exactly it is like. So it is that power that everyone has to either make or change to something or to influence or change of something. So I will stop right there, and that's what I think my contribution will be. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mulba. Those are great points. Sarah, joining us from the United States.
Hi, I would say that power is the ability to influence or kind of, I would say influence or control the actions of something or some like someone else, and to do something that they would not have otherwise done, at least in terms of international relations.
Yeah, and you may be using or may have heard of Max Weber, who's commonly used as a for the defining power as the ability to get people to do something even against resistance, right? Tennille, joining us from Germany.
I could piggyback on Sarah's word by saying it's not just like your ability, but also your capacity to do something or to act, like potential. And I think it's important because some people underestimate themselves not knowing what they're capable of. Even if you look at it in terms of like gender, men are physically have more capacity with power and strength than women. And because of that, some women may think that they are less than because of that, but it's just that women have like a different type of strength. So it's about understanding what your capacity is, what your potential is, and how you get the most of it, whatever situation it might be.
Esma, joining us from Georgia.
I think like people said what I wanted to say, but just saying that I think power is the ability to affect the environment. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I was saying that probably most of you have already said what I wanted to say, but just to reiterate, it's power is the ability of individual to affect the environment and other people around him or her.
Great.
So like to either change or actually, sustain maybe the status quo. It depends on the situation.
Yep. And Chirunim from Nigeria.
Okay, so I'll actually be coming from a different perspective. For me, to understand power, you also have to look at what it means, like powerless. So it basically means can and cannot. So for me, power is just basically the ability to get something done. You understand? It has different meanings in different ways, but it's basically the ability to get something done. Like there is something you want to get done, and the ability to get that thing done, because it is easy to look at power in the terms of influence or in terms of using force. But I think more definitions and more research has taught us about soft power. Like probably these days now, people in terms of showing their power, they may not come directly, but they use other tools, other ways in which to get something done, which may not literally need force or direct influence.
Yeah, and so Chirunim, you mentioned soft power and hard power. Those are terms that are oftentimes used in international relations, and we're gonna in some sense come to that. But I think you guys, we're gonna stop there and move on to a little more information. I think you guys, you know, quite rightly get the point, as Chirunim pointed out, and as here in the Zoom chat, I think I like what Chloe wrote, which is power is the ability to make change and affect others. And sometimes, as Sarah pointed out, despite resistance, right? Everyone should understand power because we're all in one way affected by another's power, and we have our own power. And I think that's a nice summary way of indicating something fundamental, which is that power is all around us. It's not just a few people who have power. Everybody exercises power every day. So first of all, in terms of why we should understand power, clearly it's how you change societies. So if you want to make change, as I started off at the beginning of this, we all have ideas of things that should be better in the world. We need to understand power if we want to make change. Two is we need to understand that power and directly and constantly impacts all of our lives, sometimes in ways that we're not aware. And we're going to get to that in a moment. Power, three, is and has long been highly unequally distributed in the world. But particularly since the advent of agricultural societies, when people have settled down into particular communities, and we've had increasing division of labor. And what division of labor is means some people remained farmers, but a growing number of people became artisans, and then others, because others were making enough food to provide for other people, not everybody had to be farmers. And that means that we began to develop a more and more complicated division of labor. And with division of labor comes different knowledge and skills and access to power. And that increased inequality in societies across the world, to the point where we are now, where we have highly complex societies, and some people doing very menial work, and other people doing work that is very complicated, and that allows them to control a large number of or influence a large number of people's lives. So these are some of the conditions that that explain why we should be understanding power. Now, there's a little bit of a difference between power and influence. Power is when you intentionally try to affect somebody else. Influence is when you affect somebody else intentionally or not, okay? So power is a kind of influence, but it's when we intentionally try to affect people. But there are ways in which sometimes we affect people and we're not even aware. So we have to recognize the difference between those things. But what we're focused on is when people try to change other people, or we try to change the world, or we try to change ourselves. So there are some common assumptions about power. One is that it's bad. Two is that bad people exercise power, good people don't. And three is that power is something someone else exercises, not me, because I'm a good person and other people are bad people. And so they exercise power. I'm a good person. I don't exercise power. And that power is not normal. It is an interruption from our everyday lives. And what I want to convey is that there are more accurate ways of understanding power that speak to the fact that power is among us. Essentially, it's in us and it's among us. First of all, everybody, and I think you guys recognize this, everybody exercises power. And it's not just, when we think of power, we can't think of just political power. Think of the power that parents have over their kids, the power that oftentimes husbands have over their wives. And in some cases, in many cases, the power that wives have over their husbands, the power that grandparents have over their grandchildren, the power that an employer has over an employee, the power that an employee has in a business or in a company. There are all kinds of settings in which power is exercised. Power can be second, good or bad. So it really in part depends on the eye of the beholder. In some cases, power is seen as bad by some people, and in other cases, it's seen as good. So for instance, a father who disciplines his child, the child might not think that power is good, and the father thinks that power is good, right? There's both good and bad people, assuming you believe, because some people don't believe that there are good and bad people. That's a different philosophical question we don't have to deal with today. But if you assume that there are both good and bad people, both of them exercise power. And even more complicated is that both good and bad people can exercise power in good and bad ways, depending on the social situation. So you can have a perfectly good parent who has a bad day at work and decides to yell at their child. You can have a brutal dictator who loves to hug and kiss children, or who helps build hospitals and schools, but they're still in different contexts. They're killing some of their people, right? So good and bad people exercise power in good and bad ways. And power can be ordinary or extraordinary. It can be a normal or an abnormal part of our everyday lives. So parents on an everyday basis are exercising power over their children in good and bad ways, versus visiting grandparents who only occasionally exercise a power or influence over their children and or their grandchildren. We also have everyday TV watching, right? TV is a kind of power. The people who make TV and the programs that we watch have, in some cases, deliberate power over us, right? They're deliberately trying to shape who we are and what we do. Tanil mentioned earlier social media, right? Social media is the product of particular companies, and they are trying to shape us in certain ways to do certain things. And sometimes we're not fully aware of what they're doing, right? And so that's happening on a regular basis. Every time we get on social media, that's an everyday kind of power, versus you might say a movie or a war. There are all kinds of powers that are extraordinary that happen at a particular time or at particular moments in our lives. Oops, let me pull this up here. So there are 4 types of power, and this is important because we're going to be coming back to this. One is the one that everybody would, I imagine, think of first, and that is force or coercion. And by the way, it's not just force, it's also the threat of force. And it can be force that is both physical and mental or verbal. So a verbal attack is a form of coercion. Beating, obviously, torture, imprisonment, those are forms of coercion. There's also manipulation. That's when I try to get you to do something without you knowing it. We talked about Facebook. We're very often on Facebook. The Family Diplomacy Initiative is on Facebook, and yet there are some concerns people have that Facebook is trying to shape us and gather information from us and then have people advertise to us that in ways and they're trying to influence in ways that we're not aware of. But there's also, you might be aware that food companies, generally speaking, they want you to eat their food. And how do you get people to eat their food? You increase the amount of sugar, salt, and fat or some combination of those 3 things in the food, and people like it more. The same thing with nicotine. So tobacco companies, cigarette makers, they know very well that nicotine is addictive. They've known it for many years, and they still sell it. And in fact, they try to increase the amount of nicotine sometimes in the cigarettes in order to addict people, right? So there are ways in which we are being manipulated all the time, and sometimes we're aware of it, and sometimes we're not. Persuasion is when we actually try to convince people, whether it's through rational argument or through evidence, right, that we gather, or through emotions, or through our senses, right? Touch, feel, eyesight, smells, etc., and so forth. And then lastly is authority. It's when we're trying to command people and people obey, but they may obey for a variety of reasons, and this is important. We can obey because of coercion, because if we don't obey, that person might beat us or imprison us or yell at us. We can obey because they're an expert. Think of a doctor. We can obey because somebody is really charismatic and we believe that they're great and we want to follow them. There are all kinds of reasons that we obey people, but that basis is the fundamental thing is authority. We obey them because there's something about them that leads us to obey them. Okay, so keep these four types of power in mind. We're going to come back to them. I'm going to ask you a question in a moment, but I want to just fill out this kind of four types of power and 3 degrees of power. One is extensiveness. So you can think of it as an example is like Russia. Russia is a big country. It has power over a large territory. India or China, big country in terms of population. Yes, they're big in geographically, but even bigger in terms of population. So the government of India and the government of China have big power, extensive power of a large population. 2 is comprehensiveness. It's how much or how many aspects of our lives are shaped by a certain power, a certain a person or a group or a country or a government. Or how much of a territory is and different parts of a territory are under control or being influenced. And then lastly is the intensity of the power, right? For instance, how addicted are we to cigarettes? Or how much influence does a parent have in our life? Or how much influence does a dictator have in our lives? So here's the question. And I'm going to go back to those 4 forms of power and ask you guys, which of these forms of power are rising and declining in our societies? And this is rather important. It's going to be getting to why we are increasingly important as citizen diplomats. I'm giving you some sort of a hint here, but let me go back to the forms of power and just keep this question in mind. Which of these forms of power are rising or declining in our societies? And go ahead and raise your hand when you're ready.
Can you remind us, please, the 4 forms?
Yes, sorry, Esma. Force, so coercion. So it's physical or verbal power, but it's where you're trying to essentially control people by force of some kind. 2 is manipulation, when you try to get somebody to do something and they aren't even aware of it, that you're doing something to change their behavior. 3 is persuasion, where you're using rational argument, the senses, emotion, or evidence to influence people. And 4 is authority, that people obey you, you command, and people obey for whatever reasons, because you're an expert, because you have charisma, because you have force. But the idea is people obey you because you have some basis for your authority. Joe Tolles.
Well, unfortunately, I think here in the United States, all 4 of those are on the rise. And from my perception is it's not a good thing. We're trying to manipulate people to believe that there are groups of us that are less worthy than others, and we're using persuasion to sort of back up our not out, the argument. And then when you don't follow that, where there's a threat of force, which leads to the whole, I can force you because I have the authority to force you. These are all very connected to, I think, what's happening in the United States at this moment.
Mm-hmm. So for you, all four of these are increasing. They're increasingly used, and it sounds like in bad ways. In bad ways.
Yes.
Gustavo, who's joining us.
Can
Esma, do you want to raise your hand?
Okay.
And Gustavo, who's from Costa Rica, but joining us from the United States.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I think the same as Joe, that all four of these are increasing. However, what I feel is that the division between them is becoming more, it's becoming bigger, broader, right? And also I feel that there are some types of power that are opposed, like they're like a zero-sum game, where if you have, for example, you have more coercion, then you have less manipulation, because usually when you can go through with manipulation, then you bring the force, right? So even though those are like rising, in the case of these two, you can't have them both at the same time in the same way, right? You need to have more of one and less of the other, right? But in my perspective, they are also like, the four of them are increasing also because, more like opposite forces start to arise. So for example, persuasion, we saw it like with the COVID, right? There was a lot of persuasion of trying to, bring people to actually get the vaccination, right? And the way they tried to do it, the institutions, the power, the government trying to do it was through, rational arguments, evidence, and, all this. But, I think that at least recently we have seen the power of persuasion increase in a really, well, in most of the world population, actually.
I'd love to hear from some of you who have not spoken yet. So Tadiwa, Chloe, Anna, Marvin, and Avanti, Fatima, Mulba, Abdul. There are a number of you who have not spoken yet. Would love to hear from you. If you have some thoughts here, please raise your hand. So next we have Esma from Georgia.
Yes, so I think persuasion is, well, I mean, generally speaking, if we look like back like centuries back, I would say that persuasion was not used so much as it's now, because then there was force and authority, and it was enough like to maintain whatever status quo was. But so I mean, I would say on average, probably now more persuasion is being used than centuries ago, for example. But what is concerning is that manipulation is increasingly being used. And also in some countries, like I would speak of Georgia, that authority of certain institutions and certain people, like we have people follow not ideas in terms of parties, like political party ideologies, but more they follow people. And this is kind of dangerous. Because then there is a lot of disappointment in these people, first a lot of like great expectations and then great disappointment. And also in terms of force, I mean, of course the physical force is being used, but also like the distant, like the digital force is being used, by overpowering someone with bots and trolls and almost like technology generated content. When you have to fight with a machine that spreads some kind of lies or whatever, or hate speech and so on. So yeah, that kind of verbal abuse, I think, is on the rise. And of course, physical coercion has not lost its relevance, and we still see the wars and all of that.
So what I like, Esma, about what you said is that you're looking at a broader, and I'm encouraging guys to think about the broader span of human history and the ways over that broader span of human history, which of these forms of power has risen and which has declined. Esma seems to suggest that here that coercion is, in the long span of history of world and human history, that force is declining, or coercion is declining, and persuasion might be rising. But I'm curious to hear what others think. So Tadiwa,
Also, manipulation is rising greatly. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, good point. Tadiwa, and if you could remind us, Tadiwa, where you're joining us from. Is it Kenya?
I'm joining you from Zimbabwe.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Tadiwa.
I think all the type of powers are on the rise, but it just depends on which country or continent it is. But in Zimbabwe, I think force is on the rise and persuasion as well.
Okay. So you think force is on the rise in human history?
No, in Zimbabwe, I think force. I'm speaking on behalf of my country. I think force is on the rise.
Okay.
Verbal attacks. If you look at some of the articles, you can see that verbal attack is on the rise.
Okay. So in your country in particular, Marvin, who is from China but joining us from the United States. Marvin.
Hi, everyone. I want to share something about China. After listening to you all, one thing I want to reflect about China is about authority. Traditionally, China, the kind of power is more about authority. You know, since we were young, we were educated to follow our parents' instructions. Like our parents is our authority. We always have to respect them, follow what they said to us, no matter if they are right or wrong. And after we go to school, our teachers are the authority. So our teachers center the classroom. The teacher give you whatever you want to learn. You need to learn. You don't got to choose. And after you finish school, when you go to work, your employer are the authority. You follow their instructions. You don't have much of freedom of making choices or making decisions. And also, of course, the government. Traditionally, you follow the laws, follow the rules, whatever the laws is. Sometimes the laws might be the best, but I still have to follow. But I want to see a change now because of the development of country, also because of the globalization of the world, of China open up, more people get to learn what is out of China. Number one, the authority of parents start to go down. Okay, the young children, young adults, they learn that there can be other kind of family culture. You know, they cannot realize their own power. They will argue with their parents. They will make their own choices of life. They ignore their parents' instructions. Okay, that kind of authority is going down. Secondly, the authority of the school, the teachers. Because of there are many private schools are happening now in China, children or students can have more options rather than just going to the public schools. So the authority of public school, the teachers start to go down, and the teachers start to respect children more and listen to the children more, listen to the students more. Also listen to the parents more. Before, the parents always followed that. When I was young, no matter what my teacher told my parents, they'll make sure they follow the teacher's instructions. Most of the time, they are very good, I have to say. But now, you can see on the news, there can be some arguments between the teachers and the parents, because the parents might not agree with the teachers anymore after they are, educated more. And some of them even have higher degree than teachers. So that's another authority going down in China. Last but not least, the authority of the government. you may think, oh, Chinese governments have some kind of, you think it's like a single party government, they don't have democracy. But because of, like at the beginning of this meeting, we're talking about we are all connected. Because, you know, so many Chinese people study overseas, work overseas, they know different kind of governing system in the world. That start to influence Chinese government too. You start to see more and more Chinese leaders start to focus on like democracy, start to listen to their teachers. They start to have channels for regular citizens to communicate with them. Before, they won't really listen to regular citizens. So that's some of the change in China I can reflect now.
Wow. It's really good to have your perspective, Marvin. I wish we had actually more Chinese participants on this because, you know, obviously China is a rising power in the world and you guys have an enormous population, like close to 1.4 billion people. And it's good to learn from your perspective how things are changing in Chinese society. We're gonna take one more person. I'm checking to see if there's anybody else here who has not spoken yet, would like to speak. It looks like I think Abdul. Abdul, if you could tell us where you're joining us from, and please tell us what you think. Oh, Abdul, you should turn off your video so we can hear you. The video is probably interfere. There you go. Okay, it should hopefully get better in a moment. I think let's wait a couple more seconds. Okay, can you go ahead and speak, Abdul?
Okay, I'm joining you from Burkina Faso.
Yes. You're joining us from where?
Okay. Burkina Faso.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Burkina Faso in West Africa. I think between these four types of power, all these types are rising in Burkina Faso here particularly. But I retain a question that the principal, the main power types that is rising in Burkina Faso here.
You think which ones are rising in Burkina Faso?
Coercion first.
Yeah. So coercion first is rising. Okay. Okay.
It's not too clear. We're not hearing him.
So we're going to I'm going to give you some information, and clearly there are variations. Before I tell you kind of which forms of power are rising and declining in the world, I do want to emphasize that it depends on the country, right? Some of you who are joining us from Africa pointing out whether it's Zimbabwe or Burkina Faso, that force may be on the rise, and that, you know, is an ever-changing kind of situation, it seems, depending on where you live and what elections are happening or what war is going on. But generally speaking, in the world, as Esma pointed out, coercion in the long term is declining as a form of power. And there are at least 3 reasons why that's the case. Basically, one is that it's costly. In order to maintain coercion, you have to have armies, you have to have the police, you have to have prisons, you have to have spies, you have to have street cameras. It's a lot of money and a lot of effort to maintain coercion. And because people resent it, right? When you force people, they resent it. It's harder to govern them. Second, it's even harder to govern people when they're educated. The more educated people are, the more knowledge, skills, and self-confidence they have. And across the world, more and more people are getting educated. And so that is leading to more and more people, ordinary people, having more and more power. They have that knowledge, the skills, and the self-confidence to resist coercion. People who are more educated are better able to organize themselves into groups, and groups are more powerful. So there are a variety of ways in which it's becoming harder because people are becoming more educated. And then also, lastly, going back, if you remember idealism, right? This concept that ideas really matter and that they shape relations between peoples and countries. Beliefs in human rights, in liberty, in equality, in public welfare, in the idea, right, that didn't always exist, by the way, the idea that government should actually be serving their people, not just the rich few or the elite, that they should be serving all their people. That's a relatively new concept in human history. In most of history, it was natural order that kings, queens, aristocrats ruled, and everybody else shut the hell up and follow their rule. And if not, you would get beaten or killed. So we live in modern era in a very new kind of situation in the long span. If you look at the long span of human history, we're more educated and we're more powerful, in part because of the ideas that we have, that we believe about. And if we're passionate enough about them, we organize around those ideas. So authority is also changing. It's not that authority is declining or rising, it's that the bases of authority are changing. One is because we don't have so many kings and queens and aristocrats and military and religious leaders who are dominating our lives the way they did for many, many centuries and millennia. The basis of authority is shifting from that kind of authority based on tradition, religion, or coercion, to authority based more on charisma or knowledge. And think about, so the kinds of people in our lives who have more power. They are elected politicians who are popular. People like them, like Donald Trump or the president of the prime minister of India. They are in power in part, or they were in power in the case of Donald Trump, in part because a lot of people like them. They're very excited about them. But the key thing there is not the power of that person, depends on the perceptions of the people. If people like them, then they get elected and they're supported in power. Celebrities, same thing. They have to have a certain charisma in order for them to continue exercising their power. If they don't have that charisma, if they produce an album, a music album that's no longer so popular or so good, their power declines, right? Their charismatic power declines. But there's also the rise of scientists and experts. Because science is increasingly important to our lives, we pay more attention to science and scientists, and we pay more attention to experts, right? The way in which we're going to solve the global pandemic of COVID, or now monkeypox, which is spreading in the world, is through science and through experts. Knowledge is becoming increasingly important to our lives, and therefore people who have knowledge have more power. So keep those things in mind. Charisma and knowledge are ways in which authority is increasingly based. And lastly, as Esma pointed out, and she's correct about this, manipulation and persuasion are also on the rise. In the long span of human history, it gets back to what Tanil told us earlier on about social media, right? Big part of our lives. My partner's son spends like 6 hours a day playing video games, right? On one hand, for him, it's fun. On the company that produced that game, it is an accomplishment. They persuaded him, or you can say they manipulated him. It depends on how you see it. I think it's more persuasion, but they persuaded him to spend 6 hours a day of his life playing video games, right? That's a large part of your day. That is a huge amount of power you're exercising over somebody's life if they're playing your game for 6 hours a day. And so business and media, especially, are using manipulation, and business and media, right, are increasingly part of our lives in various ways. You can think of the food we eat, the air we breathe, right, because of energy companies produce pollution that affects the air we breathe. You can think of not just social media, but the cars we drive, et cetera, and so forth. There are all kinds of ways in which we're being shaped in our everyday lives. Sometimes bad products are produced and they lead to more conflict, they lead to more death, et cetera, and so forth. So you all might know, in the United States, there's been a growing epidemic of overdose by drug addiction, people who are addicted to new drugs that are very, very powerful. There are literally tens of thousands of people dying every year in the United States from drug overdoses. And that is because of companies that have produced addictive, and they know that they're producing these addictive things, and people get addicted to them, and then they end up overdosing and dying. Right? So there are all kinds of ways in which we're being manipulated or persuaded in the world increasingly. And it's more effective. It's easier to do, in part because of technology. I want to ask you guys and shift a little here to powers that everyone has. But I want to check on the time first. And so we have about 15 minutes. And I want to shift, ask you, I'm gonna kind of reserve this discussion for when we actually have discussion beyond this. So what powers does everyone have that no matter how rich or poor? One is, regardless of who you are, rich or poor, everybody has 24 hours in the day. And what you do with that time matters to your power. If you decide to spend, and I try to convince my partner's son, Kieran, if you spend 6 hours a day playing video games, you're probably not increasing your power, as if he were interested, and he's interested in cars and the environment and so on, and try maybe to create better, more fuel efficient cars, and thus improve the environment. If he spent 6 hours a day reading about cars and reading about the environment, all the knowledge he would be developing would make him so much more powerful, right? So what we do on a daily basis, how we spend our time, is crucial to our ability to develop our power as persons. Two is, we all have, regardless of who we are, we all have the ability to develop our powers of persuasion, right? Our ability to speak effectively, our ability to touch people emotionally with our senses, et cetera, and so forth. And that's in part what we're moving towards when we talk about family storytelling, is our ability to persuade people through storytelling. Third, we all have the ability, and this gets back to what I was saying about time, we all have the ability to develop our knowledge. And knowledge is indeed power. The more you know about things, the better you're able to direct your energy to changing things effectively. Knowledge makes us more efficient and able to pinpoint where power is and how we can change power. And lastly, we have power in numbers. To the extent that we're able to bring people together in groups, groups accomplish more than any individual can, especially when you're powerless. So our ability to organize people and to inspire people to make change together is a source of power, regardless of how rich or poor we are. So there are three sectors which to think about when you think of society. And if you're trying to make change, it's worth keeping these three sectors of society in mind. Unless, of course, you want to just join a terrorist group or a revolutionary army, in which case you don't have to worry about this. You can just join it. But I'm hoping you're not trying to join a revolution or a terrorist group. Instead, if you want to work within society, you can either work in business, you can work in government, or you can work in civil society. And civil society is where paid or often voluntary activity happens, not in pursuit of profit, not in pursuit of money, that happens in business, but rather because of shared interests or values, right? People come together in families. Family is part of civil society because the shared value is raising children or just loving each other in some way. Churches, people join churches voluntarily because they believe in a particular faith and they want to promote that faith. People join nonprofit schools because they believe in the education, the good education they're going to get there. We join charities, sports club, professional associate, advocacy groups, social movements. Volunteering, in some cases we're paid, but what binds us together is that we're not looking to make money. We share certain values or certain interests in common. And so there are these sectors and these powers, and each of these sectors have more of certain kinds of powers than others. Government has more uses its power is based more on coercion and authority, and that authority is based on coercion, right? If you don't pay your taxes, the likelihood is that you're going to go to jail at some point. If you don't do as you're told on the street, if you're driving, then you're going to get fined. And if you commit some sort of serious crime, you might end up in prison. So the power of government is based on coercion, but it's a lot of authority that that people follow, in part because we don't want to get in trouble. Business tends to rely more on manipulation and persuasion. They try to sell us, to persuade us to buy their products or services, and in some cases, they manipulate us. And lastly, civil society is more based, and this is important for us because we are part of civil society. We use persuasion and an authority based either on charisma or persuasion, or in some cases in knowledge. So, given the three sectors and their powers, where are we as citizen diplomats? In business, government, or civil society? We tend to be located in civil society. Citizen diplomacy can and does happen via business and government, but when it is independent, when we are free, it is a part of civil society. When it's not manipulated by business or produced by government or business. So I want to finish off here by asking you guys, what did you find most valuable? What have you learned today that you found most valuable? And what questions do you have, if you have any? And how do you think that this applies to you and your country? And I'm going to stop sharing and open it up for discussion. If you could raise your hands, Marvin, and then Leroy.
Sorry, man, that kind of was from last time.
Okay, sorry about that, Marvin.
The other person, thank you.
Okay, Leroy.
Yeah, I actually found the type of power and the one that I on the rise and the one that I declined. And actually, I was a bit confused. Before, right now in my country, before manipulation of power was on an increase, but right now it's on a decrease. So when you were discussing about it being on an increase or on a rise, I was like, I don't think it's in Liberia. I think it's outside of this world or maybe outside of this country. But actually, I don't think manipulation is on an increase. First, the powers that are on the rise in Liberia, they first start with persuasion. They persuade you to do something because they give you the intention of what you ought to do or what they want you to do. So after persuading you, if you don't want to agree with them to do what they want you to do, then they will go authoritatively. They will use authority to command you now to make you to do it. If you still refuse to do what they are asking you to do, then definitely they introduce folks where they will either beat on you, they will either seize your property, they will either make you to look miserable in just society. So this aspect actually left me in a doubt, and I was like, Mr. Paul is actually going different way with this lecture. So thank you so much, and that's my understanding, and this is what's happening in my country right now.
Yeah, Leroy, appreciate your point. One thing about manipulation, you said that manipulation, not so sure if that's happening, is that you remember the definition of manipulation. We're often not aware of, by definition, manipulation. You're not aware that it's
yes, exactly. Where the person who is supposed to do the job is not aware of the person who is giving instruction intent, right?
Yeah,
so
usually it's not instruction. It's just like, think of it as, Facebook having an influence on you, or the food industry having an influence. I have a sweet tooth. I love sweets. That's in part because we have an industry that promotes people eating sweets so that we become addicted to their products. So there are things that yes, I'm aware of it now. So it's no longer really manipulation, you might say, but there are just ways, and we have to, part of our task is to discover what are the ways in which we're being manipulated, right? Tennille.
Yeah, I just had like one little comment and a question. When you're talking about power, I was thinking possibly there might have been like a shade of gray between persuasion and manipulation, where, for instance, some governments or companies may give you something like fake power, where they make you feel that you have the power, but like they're manipulating you to get what their way done. So I was thinking about that. And then my question is, on the power, you had something called intensity. And I wanted to know, like, as citizens, diplomats, like, how can we measure or quantify like our power? Like, how do we know the impact we're having? Is it like by how many people respond, or how do we know like what we can do with what we have?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so keep in mind, there are these three different types or ways in which the power is it's extensiveness, right? Comprehensiveness, and I'm trying to think of the other one because I can't remember the other one. But so intensiveness, comprehensiveness, and let's see here. There we go. Extensiveness, comprehensiveness, and intensity. I would say, as citizen diplomats, when you're focused on intensity, the way in which you measure that, and it's a good question. And let me just give you an example, because the example is going to be related to what we're going to be doing, is family storytelling, right? You can measure the intensity of power of a story. How do you think you can measure that intensity?
By the reaction of the people that listening, how they react towards it.
Right. So one way could be you tell a story that is so powerful, it has such an intense impact on people that they decide, let's say you end your story with, here's a way that you can donate to this. You can measure the intensity in part by how much money they donate, or you can measure the intensity by how many people choose to volunteer. They say, join me in doing this and this such and such, and the number of people who join you, well, that's more extensiveness and the number of people, but nonetheless, those are, you're right to like think about how do we go about measuring these things, and there are just different elements of this that will help us to determine how much power we're having. But the number, I would say the how many people show up to our, in part, by the way, the extensiveness of our influence, I hope, my influence in part is how many of you join us each week. That's in part the kind of persuasive power that we're trying to have. By the way, the most legitimate of those four different kinds of power, which one do you think is the most kind of the power we should all be using, as opposed to the other powers which are a little more problematic?
Persuasion.
Yeah, exactly. Persuasion is when you're actually trying to move people and you treat them as an equal, and you're trying to persuade them either by rational argument, emotion, or else. It's not you're trying to manipulate them. You're not trying to use force, and you're not trying to say you should obey me because I'm great. It's instead we're equals, and hey, I want to tell you something that's really important, and I hope that you will join me. Int'l. And I think I'm mispronouncing your name. I'm sorry. How do you say your name?
It's Int'l.
Int'l. I'm sorry.
Okay. I think our time is up. Even though let me just paraphrase it. As we are living in a world of change, I think what we should do, especially when I'm thinking about my country, if we don't initiate change, and then we can be the victim of those who are causing the changes especially I'm talking politically. If we don't initiate change, and then we can be the victims of those who are in the systems or controlling. That's all I can say.
Yeah, Int'l, and that's really important, right? We have to be more aware of power, right? Because otherwise we can be manipulated. It's a good point. We are going to take, I just read a couple of your questions. One is as whether this guy next to me is my father. That is my father. Do you want to say hello?
Hello. It's what you're
Hi, Dad. How are you?
Hi, Dad.
What you're discussing is interesting, but I look at it from a little different point of view and probably not very useful. But I've always been told that a reaction always gives rise to an opposite reaction. And if you look at situations where, as you mentioned, power and different forms of power have to be used, you may want to try and guess where a reaction is likely to come from. Sometimes it's the most unexpected way, and all the thought that you've given to the uses of persuasion and other forms of power have absolutely nothing to do with the situation. And for instance, the climate problem. Do nothing about the climate, it's still going to end up making you miserable, making the world miserable. But you can try and do something. So you have instances where you can do nothing and you're in trouble. So look at when you're discussing these things, look at all the possible sources of conflict that could arise. If you give drugs to a person who has bad habits and is hooked, you may be condemning him to a life of misery. You may be condemning him to suicide. You may be giving rise to all different kinds of reactions. Yeah. Look at what is likely to happen, and also look for the unlikely to happen.
Yeah. Good point. So you guys got to hear a little bit from my father, who is 92 years old. So he's doing pretty well. Esma, and so we're going to finish off with just Esma and Joe, and then we are going to take a photo of everybody. So if you can be aware, if you can, coif your hair, etc., and so forth. But Esma and Joe first. Esma.
I just really wanted to make two comments, one about video games and generally like creating alternative reality. And this is, I think it's kind of, it really worries me, even though I'm pretty young. I mean, and I should be more like accepting and welcoming of technologies, but I'm like always thinking, when you spend so much time in video games that make you addicted, and that like make you feel as if you are changing something. A lot of times you are, I don't know, building nations there, and I don't know, cultivating some crops or doing whatever, and it makes you feel as if you are really doing something, but in reality you are not, because I mean, these are just virtual nations and these are just virtual crops, and you can really spend this time maybe contributing to your real society and your real societal needs. And another thing that really worries me is also that sometimes, because I'm engaged in different advocacies with the government, and when I see that the laws that, for example, we have been advocating for increase of the disability pensions, and the government would not want to do it, but at the same time, they suddenly changed the law allowing dual citizens receiving both like pensions both in the countries of both of their like citizenship, let's say, which was not the case previously. Previously, you had to choose in which country to receive your disability allowance. And that was not advocated by anyone, or at least it was not publicly, advocated. And when I've seen, how much effort has been put into different other advocacies, and nothing has changed, while this changed in a night without, let's say, any visible demand, it's very, very worrisome, I would say, and disappointing in a way. Thank you.
Thanks, Esma. Joe.
Well, I learned that I am more concerned than ever before when you talk about the things that are increasing people's power. Here in the United States, the truth of the matter is education is not increasing, it's decreasing. The number of students enrolling in bachelor's programs is decreasing by hundreds of thousands. And the people that are in power now are canceling education. They're removing content in secondary schools. The quality of education is being challenged. They're vilifying education, they're vilifying experts. And then so the majority of our population is getting a lot of their education through TikTok, Facebook, because there's been such a confusion placed into our information channels that people are not trusting it. And so when we do have those groups of people who feel disenfranchised and are maybe uneducated, we have things like just happened to our Capitol, where they come together based on, here, I don't know how many people know about the big lie, but that becomes truth and that becomes their education. And our education is based on snippets. When you can ask Alexa the question and not have to really delve into its content or the meaning behind it, we're in a serious problem here, which may impact, and has impacted in some ways our democracy.
My father really liked your point. He just said very, very good point. I hope, though, that some of what we talked about has made you aware of at least that we have more power than we think we have, and that it really depends in part on what we do alone and together. And I think that's part of what we want to kind of move into the next session with, is that sense. So next time, if all goes well, I will not be the only one talking. There will about these things. There will be a professor from the University of Nottingham in England, who's a professor of diplomacy, who will be sharing in part, and we're going to get more specific. Today was kind of big picture and big concept, but we're going to get more into the weeds of what citizen diplomacy is, and the kinds of power that we can exercise next time over the next couple of sessions. And then after that, we begin family storytelling. And so I'm excited to kind of get to that point. With that said, if you can turn on your cameras, if you don't have your cameras turned on, and let's take a photo of everybody, as many of you as possible. And on 3, I'm going to ask you to smile. Abdul, if you can have your camera on, please. Mulba, Aaron, Esma, if possible. Fantastic. All right, on 3. 1, 2, 3, smile. Fantastic, everybody. Thank you all for your time, and see you next Sunday.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
All right.